Both those of you here in the room and those of you who are watching on BGC TV somewhere else in this world. Our speaker tonight is Gerritsen, who is professor of history at the University of Warwick, and Gerritsen, who holds the Kikkoman Chair for the study of Asia-Europe intercultural dynamics with special attention to material culture, art, and human development at the University of Leiden. Her background is in Chinese studies. She has an MA from Leiden and PhD from Harvard University. Her first book, Jian Literati and the Local in Song Yuan Ming China, published in Leiden by Brill in 2007. She has, in the most recent years, been heavily involved in two large-scale projects: Global Jingdezhen, Local Manufacturers and Early Modern Global Connections, which has been funded by the AHRC, and the Global Material Culture of Early Modern Connections, also funded by the AHRC and co-directed by Giorgio Riello. And I should say that through the magic and accident of siloed planning, we can offer you both Professor Gerritsen tonight and Professor Riello next Tuesday night. So we have the Warwick Material Culture group in New York at the Bard Graduate Center, coincidentally, in these very weeks. She's the author of a series of fascinating inquiries into the global culture of making, in particular of porcelain and its migration through the world. Just to give you some titles of work that she has done: Porcelain and the Material Culture of the Yuan Court, 1279 to 1368, in the Journal of Early Modern History. Introduction to Global China, Material Culture and Connections in World History, and Material Culture and the Other, European Encounters with Chinese Porcelain, in the Journal of World History, 2012. Ceramics for Local and Global Markets, Jingdezhen's Agora of Technologies, in a volume entitled Cultures of Knowledge, Technology in Chinese History. A 13th century cult in the villages of Jian, Jiangxi, or Fieldwork for Historians, in the Journal of Song Yuan Studies. What was the year in that? I seem not to have that here. Anyway, and
2009?
2009? 8?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe
Women in the Life and Thought of Chen Cui, The Perspective of the 17th Century, published in 1999. Very recently, she is, along with Giorgio Riello, editor of a volume entitled Writing Material Culture History, which was published last year, 2014, by Bloomsbury. It's a pleasure to have her here speaking about new work that potentially will go into a project that she will be conducting during a year's leave next academic year. So it's a pleasure to invite Anna to the podium. Please.
Thank you very much. That's a very generous introduction, and it's wonderful to see so many people here. And I'm really delighted to talk to you about this work, which is very preliminary, as you see. It's taken me into directions that I hadn't quite expected, directions that I haven't by any means explored fully, again, as you will see. So I apologize for the somewhat preliminary nature, and I look very much forward to hearing all of your provocations and critiques afterwards. The sentence I chose for my title, "The best rhubarb is that which is brought from China, fresh and new," comes from a late 16th century English herbal. Just from that quote, we can surmise that rhubarb was considered a desirable commodity in late 16th and 17th century England, that it was available in different qualities, of which freshly delivered rhubarb from China was considered the very top of the range. And just here to illustrate that. The second in goodness, continues the text, is that which comes from Barbary. The last and worst from Bosphorus and Pontus. The author of those words, John Gerard, who was born in 1545 and died in 1612, was by no means the first European herbalist to know about rhubarb and its availability in different qualities. In 1554, when a Flemish Jesuit based in Hormuz, a man named Caspar Barzeus, gifted rhubarb to St. Ignatius of Loyola, he specifically chose the rhubarb not just from China, but from northwest China, delivered overland to Hormuz. So here, Hormuz, and delivered probably from around this region. So Gerard's herbal was by no means the first, but it was probably the most widely circulated botany books in English in the 17th century. So we can also probably assume that all those, or the vast majority of those who knew about rhubarb in 17th century England, knew about it from Gerard's herbal, and thus also knew about the link to China. So what I want to discuss with you today is not so much the great importance and proper method of cultivating and curing rhubarb in Britain, because as you see, that particular wonderful publication was already produced by Sir William Fordyce in 1792. Nor do I particularly want to give you the complete global history of the trade in this commodity. Both Erica Monahan in Early Modern Things, a recent publication, and even more recently Matt Romagnello in the Journal of Global History have discussed rhubarb in that particular context. Both of them, in fact, with special attention to the Russian dimension of the global trade in rhubarb in the 18th century particularly. What I'm interested in this case is what Giorgio Riello and I have termed the global lives of things, as you see in this publication that you just mentioned, and in my case specifically, the global life of rhubarb. Specifically, I'm interested in the ways in which this substance comes into being in early modern minds and bodies by asking what exactly rhubarb is, according to these different descriptions that emerge in early modern writings. I'm curious about this connection with China that is made so emphatically in Gerard's herbal. And so what I hope to reflect on in the conclusion of this paper is the ways in which European knowledge about China was mediated not only through its durable material legacy, so porcelain and other decorative materials are the obvious examples of that, but also through its materia medica and its edible substances. In order to do that, or in order to make a start with that, I should say probably, we have to track back to the earliest establishment in European minds of a specific connection between rhubarb and China, which I suggest occurred, in fact, as early as the 13th century. In 1253, another Fleming, the Franciscan monk William of Rubruck, or van Ruysbroek, wrote one of the first European descriptions of rhubarb being used for medicinal purposes in Asia. When visiting the court of the Mongol chieftain in Karakorum, so that's at the very end of his trip, right at the end there, he described the healing practices of a Nestorian monk. And I quote, "He had a certain root called rhubarb, and he chopped it up till it was nearly powder, put it in water with a little cross which he had, and on which was a raised image of the Saviour, and by which he said he could find out whether a sick person would recover or die. If he was to escape, it stuck on the sick person's breast as if glued there. If not, it did not stick. And when we went in," he writes a little bit later, "she, the patient, got up from her couch, worshipped the cross, put it reverently beside her on a silk cloth, drank some holy water and rhubarb, and washed her breast with it." So, the patient's survival and Rubruck's account of that laid important foundations for the European association of rhubarb with the Mongol Asian world. Until then, certain varieties of rhubarb had been known in Europe, but they'd not been so precisely located. The Greek physician of the 1st century AD, Dioscurides, most notably described the medicinal properties of rhubarb. and located its source as lying beyond the Bosphorus. So what Dioscorides mentioned was Ra ponticum, much like the common or garden rhubarb we know today. It was the Ra, as he knew rhubarb, named after the Greek word for Volga, from Pontus, the region in northern Anatolia, south of the Black Sea. So we're talking just in this Pontus here, this region. So the Ra pontica is one variety, and then the Ra barbarum was the lesser known Ra from an unspecified origin further to the east. So if we look at that same region here on this map, let me see. Where's my pointer? So in this region, Ra barbarum, a slightly unspecified and further reaching area. So not so much located very precisely on the map. It was Marco Polo, in fact, in the late 13th century, who pinned its place of origin more specifically on the map. Polo writes, "In all the mountains of this region, rhubarb grows in great abundance. It's brought here by merchants who exported, it's bought here by merchants who exported far and wide." The region he refers to in this quote is a place called Suzhou, inhabited by Christians and idolaters who are subjects of the great Khan, part of the major province of Tangut. Confusingly, so this is the region of Tangut. Confusingly, this Suzhou is located in what is now Gansu, while the more famous Suzhou is in Jiangsu, a splendid city described by Marco Polo as populated by merchants of great wealth and consequence who live by trade and industry, who have silk in great quantity and make much silken cloth for their clothing, and who are skilled practitioners of every craft, wise philosophers and natural physicians. Here, in this wealthy urban city in Jiangsu, Polo also sees rhubarb. In the adjacent mountains, rhubarb and ginger grow in great profusion, so that one Venetian groat would buy 40 pounds of fresh ginger of excellent quality. In fact, no such mountains are located near the Jiangsu Suzhou, as Frances Wood pointedly states in her Did Marco Polo Go to China? But Hans Ulrich Vogel, who wrote Marco Polo was in China, in turn relying on the scholarship by Stephen G. Hoare, who wrote a book called Marco Polo's China, a Venetian in the realm of Kublai Khan, speculate, however, that Marco Polo may have been combining two different kinds of rhubarb. One, dahuang, the root of rhubarb, the rhubarb plant that indeed grows in Gansu, and known as dahuang in Chinese. The other, tu dahuang, local dahuang, which doesn't have the same medicinal properties, but does grow in the Jiang and Huai region where Suzhou is located. Be that as it may, ever since Marco Polo's account, the mountainous regions of Suzhou in Gansu came to be known as the source of superb rhubarb, and the association of rhubarb in China's material and botanical wealth was firmly established. It's worth pausing briefly to think about Polo's words. Rhubarb grows in great abundance. Polo's first reference wastes no words on explaining what exactly rhubarb is. Presumably, he expects his readers to know already. The second doesn't either, although here the term rhubarb gains some more meaning through its association with ginger, and his situating the commodity within an economy of value mediated by the Venetian groat. In fact, Polo identifies Fuzhou, further to the south than Jiangsu, as a source of even better priced ginger, where a Venetian groat would get you not 40, but 80 pounds of ginger. Ginger is fairly ubiquitous in the travels and usually listed together with pepper, cinnamon, and silk as one of the many fruitful commodities produced and traded in the very productive lands Polo describes. Ginger was, of course, known throughout the ancient and medieval worlds, both for its health-giving properties and as a spice, but rhubarb less so. Yet Polo adds no further detail on what to him rhubarb is. And while Polo may well have had experience and or knowledge of Dioscoridan medicinal substances, we actually have to conclude that it's not possible to know exactly what the word rhubarb meant in Polo's experience. So a clear connection between rhubarb and China, but no sense that knowledge about rhubarb travelled in tandem with this association. There certainly seems little evidence to suggest that Polo was versed in Chinese medical and botanical knowledge that circulated in the 13th and early 14th centuries. I'm sorry that this has come out so bleached out, but there at the top there it says Da Huang, and this is a little drawing of the leaf and the root underneath. Sorry, I can't even seem to make the pointer very clear. But anyway, this is Da Huang, and this is the remainder of the text towards the left. That Chinese knowledge, of course, had a very long and complex history of its own, starting with the now no longer extant herbal of the legendary Shennong Emperor, the Shennong Buncaojing. We have medical notes dating to the Han Dynasty, the 1st and 2nd century AD to be precise, describing the medicinal properties of Da Huang. So that's the term we would now translate as rhubarb root, but I will use Da Huang where appropriate, as follows. And this is in the translation of Yang Shouzhong. And I just want to point out that what's underneath here is a more literal translation of these characters here in black from a very recent PhD by Bianhe. So you can compare, you can either read the Chinese or you can read this more literal translation or listen to this slightly more anglified translation. Da Huang is bitter, cold, and not toxic. It mainly precipitates blood stasis, blood block, and cold and heat. It breaks concretions and conglomerations, accumulations and gatherings, and lodged rheum and abiding food. It flushes the stomach and intestines to weed out the stale and bring forth the new. It disinhibits and frees the flow of water and grain, regulates the center to transform food, and quiets and harmonizes the 5 viscera. It grows in mountains and valleys. So the main categorization of the efficacy of rhubarb root that emerges from this then is that Da Huang is a bitter tasting drug with a cooling function, meaning that it would be used in the context of the very broad category of cold damage disorders, which we might generally relate to the sensation of excessive heat associated with what we would call infectious febrile disorders. Moreover, the Chinese medical knowledge established that Da Huang has a purgative function, hence verbs like breaking up conglomerations, flushing the stomach, and freeing the flow. In different ways, all the Chinese materia medica that emerged over the centuries that followed this first compilation followed on from this Shennong Buncaojing. So, for example, the 8th century medical compendium Wai Tai Miao Fang, a title usually translated as Arcane Essential Formulas from the Imperial Library, relied heavily on the use of rhubarb root in preparations for a wide range of medical conditions, usually together with other ingredients and always in connection with either cold damage disorders or for its purgative qualities. Chinese medical knowledge in the 12th and 13th centuries had undergone a recent and very significant transformation. Compendia were expanded with new prescriptions and new drugs incorporated into the wider corpus of medications. Scholars have explained this transformation in general terms by pointing to the population growth, the economic expansion, urbanization, advances in printing technology, etc., that characterized the Song dynasty as a whole. The Song court sponsored large publishing projects out of which a canon of imperial medicine emerged. More specifically, Asaph Goldschmidt has highlighted the importance of the southward migration, so from northern China into what we now think of as southern China, of the period for the expansion of medicinal plants and drugs, and the accompanying botanical and medical knowledge of the Song dynasty. One of the standard works of this period, the Chongxiu Zhenghe Jingshi Zhenglei Beiyong Bencao, so the Zhenghe Bencao for short, published in 1294 by Zhang Cunhui, the revised Zhenghe Reign Materia Medica for Urgent Use, classified and verified from the classics and histories, for example, and the text we see there, listed 50% more drugs than a publication only 50 years earlier. Dahuang, rhubarb, was not a new drug in this Zhenghe Bencao, but as the layout of this printed text illustrates, and again I apologize if this isn't easier to see, the main text of the Shennong Bencao Jing, which is the characters in black, there we go, these characters in black here, have been expanded with all of these further explanations all along this lower section. So these are the pages that follow, with further explanations about its use, quotations from other medical compilations, and experience of individual medical practitioners. The 13th century is key then to understanding rhubarb as having a global life. It was in the writings of the early European travelers along the Silk Road, notably men like Rubruck and Polo, that rhubarb gained the precise association with the borderlands of Central Asia and China, and through them that rhubarb became known in Europe for its potency, both in medicinal and economic terms. But it was in the Chinese Bencao literature that potency of Dahuang, its ability to relieve the excessive heat we associate with fevers, and its purgative qualities, was classified and codified. There's a further dimension to the circulation of knowledge about rhubarb in the 13th century world. As Robert Himes, I don't think he's here, he's local at Columbia, has shown in a piece published in the Medieval Globe, which forms part of a much larger and ongoing research project entitled, as you see here, A Hypothesis on the East Asian Beginnings of the Yersinia pestis polytomy. Chinese sources dating to the 13th century, and 1226 and 1270 specifically, refer to rhubarb in the context of epidemics. There was an epidemic in the army, and only those who received rhubarb were curable. Nearly 10,000 men were saved. More specifically, these quotes refer to rhubarb as a cure for an epidemic involving raised sores. In other words, this might refer, and we don't know this for sure, to what we would call the Bubonic Plague. Himes' published work so far is preliminary, and I'm sure very important work forthcoming, but it points to some extremely significant new insights. The epidemic referred to in these Chinese historical sources is in all likelihood plague, the very same plague, or Black Death, that spread along with the Mongols in their expansion into, first of all, Jin and Song China, and then in the other direction through Central Asia to Europe. But the starting point of that plague epidemic can therefore now be pinned by these sources that he has uncovered to an earlier date than traditionally assumed, and quite specifically to the Mongol invasion of the Tungut lands of the Xia dynasty, in other words, to Gansu, which we have already seen was the natural habitat of the best rhubarb. For Marco Polo, knowledge of Gansu as the home of rhubarb was important, though not necessarily, as we saw, new information. And it was with Marco Polo that this knowledge about rhubarb gained new recognition and circulation more widely, and in Europe. Interestingly, that knowledge moved along precisely the same pathways of 13th century global interactions as the disease that would go on to wipe out perhaps as much as, eventually, in total, 60% of the Afro-Eurasian population. The Chinese medicinal world of the 13th century had connected rhubarb and the spread of epidemic disease, as we saw in the quotes above. Only those who received rhubarb were curable. And actually, as an aside, and this is where I have to say this is very preliminary, and this is where I really venture into fields that I have no idea how to really do this effectively. But if you look at contemporary research, both on medicinal goods coming out of China and the connection to medicine that is effective against Yersinia pestis, so the polytomy that has the bacterium that causes pest, they are finding out that there is a connection between the two. So this is not just an assumed connection that the Chinese scholarship points out, but something that Western scholarship studying these effective ingredients, rein as the element in rhubarb, confirm this same association. But anyway, that's as an aside and requires much more research. So insofar as I can tell, even though in the 13th century knowledge of rhubarb root and the root itself, as well as the disease, spread along the major connecting travel and trade routes of Central Asia, the use of rhubarb as a cure for plague did not. It's much harder to trace rhubarb in the 14th and 15th century, although in light of the very same Black Death of the middle of the 14th century in Europe and the vast wipeout of the population it brought about, that's perhaps not entirely surprising. Of course, knowledge of the medicinal qualities of rhubarb root itself does continue to show up in the written sources, as evidenced, for example, from 15th century European and Chinese compendia of medical knowledge. So just a couple of examples. This text, the Puji Fang Formula for Universal Benefit, usually dated to 1390, compiled by Zhu Xiao, the fifth son of the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty, refers to the use of dahuang throughout, though not necessarily related to epidemic disease. And in Europe, where rhubarb and other medicines were expensive and exclusively available to the highest elites, medieval Dutch manuscripts of the 15th century reveal a regular use of rhubarb in prescriptions for a variety of afflictions, ranging from jaundice and facial disfigurement to women's problems related to the uterus. But these sources fall silent on the geographical source of the plant. After Polo, and after the fall of the Mongol Empire and the establishment of the Ming dynasty in China, for a time at least, no new knowledge from China made its way to Europe. The most significant development in 16th century China was the new system of classification that came about with the publication of the Buncao Gongmu. In 1578, Li Shizhen completed what would become the most extensive pharmacopoeia of its kind. His Buncao Gongmu, literally outline and details of roots and plants, contains more than 1,800 different medical substances and over 11,000 prescriptions, which reclassified the entire materia medica according to a new logic inspired by Gewu Zhexie, the investigation of things, which shaped 16th century thought in China. It confirmed the central place of rhubarb root in the medical constellation. Dahuang remained highly valued for its purgative qualities, and those qualities were well regarded not just for complaints of the stomach and the digestive tract, but also for the purging of blood and for flushing out other accumulations such as mucus and food, and hence valued for use in the protection against the spread of infectious disease. So just to show you a couple of other editions, so this text, the Buncao Gongmu, was constantly updated and expanded and illustrated and further compiled. And here's a section of, here we see again the characters for dahuang. So this is one text with a long explanation of how rhubarb root might be used. And if I can get it to the next slide, there are the kind of illustrations of the text. So again, the illustration is fairly simple and recognizable from the earlier illustration that you saw. Did that Chinese repertoire of medical knowledge travel, and if so, how and when? So far, I have to say, no direct evidence of that. This mid-16th century apothecary jar at least makes the circulation of rhubarb itself tangible again. The jar is inscribed with the words, and you can't quite see that on this image here, with the words "pil de Rhubardo," or rhubarb pills, and confirms the 16th century circulation of medicinal rhubarb between China and Renaissance Italy. Ramuzio, known mostly, of course, as the editor of Marco Polo's travels, left a record stating that he met a Persian merchant in Murano, in the Venetian lagoon, who had brought a large consignment of rhubarb from Suzhou in Gansu, as we'd seen earlier, the best place to buy rhubarb, and brought it to Venice via the overland route. Interestingly, perhaps unsurprisingly, in the post-Black Death world of the 16th century, where infectious disease, generally referred to as the pestilence, continued to whirl around the European population, and took its victims regardless of age or station, there's evidence that rhubarb did come to be associated with a cure against the pest. So we have a 16th century commodity traded throughout Eurasia, valued for its medicinal properties everywhere it was used, without any direct evidence of a connection between the two repertoires of knowledge, but a gradual convergence of medical practices involving rhubarb. It was, in fact, the 16th century German scholars who were most explicit about the potential of rhubarb to combat pestilence. This German broadside of 1520, now in the British Library, specifies that for the grausamen Plague die Pestilenz, for the gruesome plague that is pestilence, take 3 or 4 quintin with wine and drink this. Even smelling it will have some effect. And I apologize that this really isn't big enough to see it. The reference to pestilence is somewhere here. I can find some way of enhancing that, I'm sure, if need be. And here is another medical tract of the mid-16th century. And I'm just translating from this bit here. Nun folgt wie der Mensch halten soll. That bit. Now follows how man should keep and take care of himself so that he is safeguarded from the pest for a whole year, a month, or 24 hours. This is the beginning of a section für Pestilenz, against the pest, by the 16th century Swiss medic and philosopher Paracelsus. His 1554 text provides instructions on how to make both powder of rhubarb and rhubarb pills, stating explicitly the suitability even for women and children, followed by the procedure for taking it together with an electuary, a medicinal substance mixed with honey or some other sweet substance. So just to go back to this previous one, so here, so das Pulver nimmt Rhubarbara ein halb Lot, and here die Pille von Rhubarbara macht also, nimmt den besten Rhubarbara, etc. Rhubarb powder and pills taken together with this electuary for 9 days, together with an intense program of bloodletting in different combinations and quantities for those who can only afford it for shorter periods, all aimed at driving the poison out of the body and keeping the patient safe from the horrors of the pest. Paracelsus' main contribution was his challenge to the Galenic humoral theories current in the 16th century and the emphasis he placed on pharmacopoeia, or the biochemistry of medication. There is again no evidence to suggest a direct connection between this purgative use of rhubarb and the medical knowledge of Da Huang that circulated in the Bunzhao literature in China, and yet clearly throughout 16th century Eurasia, rhubarb root was considered a potent ally in the constant battle against the disease that claimed so many human lives. What we've seen so far, then, is a commodity that is traded from a distant land, associated in Europe with the fabled East that was known through Polo's writings, or delivered by Persian traders via the overland route, available exclusively to the richest elites for combating the disease against which there was no effective remedy. Arguably, both the land of its origin and the nature of its efficacy remained attractively elusive, which may well explain its popularity. By the turn of the 17th century, a number of significant changes imply a turning point in the global life of rhubarb. Broadly speaking, these changes can be summarized as follows. Firstly, pestilence drops away from the main concern as the Eurasian population builds up resistance, which means that rhubarb comes to be seen more generally as an all-purpose drug and gradually only as the drug of choice for digestive problems. Secondly, the Jesuit and other travelers begin to frequent China, which means the availability of more knowledge about the cultivation and storage of the rhubarb plant. Thirdly, the emergence of the VOC and EIC in the trade of rhubarb, meaning that it started to become cheaper and more widely available. And finally, the vernacularization of botanics, leading to a much wider circulation of images of rhubarb than ever before. Let me flesh these changes out with some examples. In 16th century oh, sorry, let me just skip forward again. In 16th century Mechelen, in the Spanish Low Countries, a man with the name of Rembert Dodoens, or Dodonaeus, in his Latinized name, was born. He remained mostly a local kind of guy. He married a local girl and established himself as a doctor in the city of his birth, only spending a couple of years for study in Basel, in Switzerland, and refusing to take up a position at the Spanish court. Only at the very end of his life, in 1582, did he take up a position at the newly established University of Leiden, in the northern, now free, Low Countries. Dodoens spent his lifetime compiling information and publishing in the field of botanical sciences. His most famous publication is the book you see here, the Kruidenboek, first published in 1554, expanded in 1563, and finally published in 6 volumes by Plantijn in Antwerp. It was also translated into Latin by Charles de l'Écluse, who known as Carolus Clusius, in 1583, and would go on to form the basis for John Gerard's Herbal that we started with. Men like Dodonaeus and Clusius, despite their predilection for Latinized names, were keen to translate into the vernacular the classical text of botanics, herbals, and medical knowledge, including the work of Dioscorides, and to update the writing of the classical authors with information gleaned from first-hand observations. Their works were enhanced with detailed drawings, which made their publication interesting ventures for the publishing houses of Antwerp and Amsterdam. Dodoens' description of rhubarb then starts, after a disclaimer about confusions about the varieties of this plant, with Dioscorides and Pliny, but then points out this Dioscorides only speaks of the Ra found in Turkish land, above the Black Sea and in the lands surrounding the Meotis Pilus. So let me show you where that is on the map. That's this here. And if you, I think I also have, oh no. Sorry. Dioscorides, he argues, only had access to the rhubarb that was grown in this part of the world. Dodoens wants to focus on a different root, larger, thicker, and coarser than Dioscorides raponticum. It's the China link that sets the two apart. The root of Ra, Dodoens writes, is sent here, meaning to Europe, from het landschap China, the land of China, located in the east beyond the Ganges in India. Rhubarb is also not from the land of the Sinites in Arabia Felix, the Arabian Peninsula, Dodoens is at pains to point out. While Ra barbaricum suggests an origin in Arab and African lands, he continues, the Arab and African name of Ravet Senai is more suitable as it points to its origins in China. And while Dodoens acknowledges that Dioscorides raponticum helps a weak stomach, Dodoens points out that Dioscorides makes no mention at all of the purgative qualities of the root from China. In fact, Dodoens knows all about this combination of the so-called samentrekking and the open and the kracht, the astringent as well as the purgative qualities of the rhubarb root, which are precisely the qualities that make it the so-called wondrous drug, as some have said. It was the establishment and development of the Jesuit foothold in China that moved European knowledge of the Chinese roots of rhubarb forward. Matteo Ricci wrote in his letters home about rhubarb, noting not only its ubiquity in China, but also its circulation throughout Asia and its export to Europe at exorbitant prices in Ricci's eyes. You can buy a pound of rhubarb for 10 cents, which in Europe would cost 6 or 7 times as many gold pieces. What Matteo Ricci, his colleague Diego de Pantoja, and later Alvarez Semedo, all Jesuits stationed in what was until then still the Ming Empire, were able to clarify was that rhubarb could and should be located more specifically in space. It was brought in, i.e. in Beijing, from the west by the Saracens, according to Ricci, delivered to the imperial court by Turks and Moors, according to Pantoja, and traded by merchants representing Moorish kings in Semedo's views. Their comments and observations had a big impact. They not only located the source of the source of rhubarb in geographical and political space, but provided access to first-hand observations from China to enhance the botanical and medical knowledge of physicians like Doduns, and thereby laid the foundations for the 17th century representations of rhubarb as Chinese. A man, for example, like Jacob Bontius, based in Batavia as an employee of the VOC until his death in 1631, wrote down his first-hand observations of disease and local medicines both in India and in the Dutch East Indies, including the use of rhubarb as a purgative. This 1673 edition of the Oost-Indische Warande includes a discussion of medications for combating outbreaks of the pest on board the ships sailing to East Asia, and most wonderfully this, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the word hondendrek. That's not a word I would normally use in a talk, so dog excrement, as a medicine that, and then this is even more surprising, den Rubarbe te boven, veel te boven gaat hier, den Rubarbe te boven. So it's even better than rhubarb, believe it or not. Men like de Bontius, and the Polish Jesuit Michael Boehm, who was in China from 1643 to 1659, brought with them to Asia a background in botanics and medical science. Boehm's observations about rhubarb would set the standard for rhubarb knowledge in Europe for more than 2 centuries. His book Flora Sinensis, published in Vienna in 1656 and in a French translation in 1696, provided observations on flowers and fruits, spices and medicinal plants, and animals particular to China, with 30 beautiful colored illustrations. So here on the left, even with an attempt to write Da Huang Gan at the top there, with beautiful colored illustrations. What strikes me most is not so much the detail on the soil in which the plant grows, which emerges in this French translation, the size of the leaves, the height of the stem, the color of the root, but particularly Boehm's description of the method of harvesting. Cut while fresh in the winter, dried first on long tables for 3 to 4 days, and then in the wind, but always avoiding direct sunlight. What matters to Boehm is the medicinal power contained in the root. In the winter, toutes les vertus de la plante sont enfermées dans la racine. So they're contained in the root. In the sunshine, that power is weakened. Boehm emphasized the medicinal power of the root that somehow had to be captured and preserved, a concern emerging undoubtedly from the long distances the root usually traveled before arriving in the marketplace in Europe, and probably its desiccated state. Dutch observers added a further dimension to this knowledge of harvesting techniques. Johan Nieuwenhof wrote that rhubarb does not grow wild, as some report, but is raised and increased with great care and diligence. The idea of rhubarb as a crop that was raised and increased was entirely new to the European observers. Nieuwenhof restated Boehm's view that sunbeams extract their virtue from the roots, and detailed that the Chinese make a hole through the roots and hang them to dry in the shade. And ever the observer of trade, Nieuwenhof explained that the rhubarb brought to Europe by sea would have come from Shanxi and Suzhou, and from Kashgar, Tibet, Persia, and Mughur, southern Siberia. But it was his information of rhubarb as a cultivated crop that transformed the visual imagery of the rhubarb root in Europe. A Dutch book of the 17th century, now in the special collections of the University of Leiden, is a good example. De Nederlandse Hovenier formed part of a book called Het Vermakelijk Landleven, a kind of pleasurable country life, a highly popular, frequently translated and reprinted, but also rather eclectic volume, put together in 1669 by Jan van der Groen, the gardener to William III, when he was Prince of Orange. 17th century burghers in the Netherlands were enthusiastic gardeners, especially in their newly established country estates. Then Nederlandse Hovenier offered details on what plants one might put in such an estate garden, including in the kitchen garden Munnick's Rhubarbe, which had leaves like the paper whortle, the pepper root, and Raponticum, with leaves like cabbage that will flourish in the moist soil in the shade, and roots that could be split. Het vermakelijk landleven, a kind of country living avant la lettre, created the impression that every Dutch burgher could grow their own rhubarb. But in fact, as Erica Monahan has discussed in her study of rhubarb, rhubarb mutated easily, leading not only to a multitude of variant rhubarb plants, but to a loss of precisely the medical qualities rhubarb from China was wanted for. Part 3 of Het vermakelijk landleven is entitled Den ervaren huishouder of the medicijnwinkel and contained prescriptions and remedies. There we find rhubarb used for relieving gallbladder problems, drinking a mixture of pulverized rhubarb root and wijnsteen or Sincera clavillato, a kind of caustic ash diluted with beer or meat juice, but again mostly for the relief of stomach-related problems. Rhubarb was wanted as a way of purging the stomach, normally used together with the equally purgative senebladeren, chamomile, aniseed, fennel, boiled in water and sweetened with sugar. The special quality that made rhubarb a wondrous drug, as I said, rhubarb could be used both for the opposite, also for the opposite purpose. It also had astringent qualities. For this, a mixture was made of rhubarb, nutmeg, oily root, knotgrass, and poppy seed, sweetened with the syrup of pomegranate. But if the crop can be cultivated in China, it should be cultivated in Europe, the impression was. In 1646, a man named Matthäus Merian produced a large emblem book. The members of Der Fruchtbringenden Gesellschaft, the fruit-bearing society, are each represented with a Gesellschaft member's emblem and a motto, a short poem, and the members' initials. If you look here, these initials are down here. So here's the motto and the nickname of the plant here, and a short poem. A chart, in fact, at the end of the book lists the names that match the initials, although this particular number doesn't seem to be included in the ones that I've consulted so far. The rhubarb plant, so this is the rhubarb plant here, shows the plant and its root in a landscape with a vista onto a small conurbation in the background and what looks like sheds and a path in the background on the right. It's a cultivated landscape, but the plant is not in proportion with it, and the root looks like it's been processed in some way. The text explains that the root helps young and old alike, and that in the field of medicine, this root cannot be improved upon. The final lines go back to the purgative qualities again, von den Lasten wir befreit bleiben rein. Unfortunately, although the printed list of names matching these emblems was updated in the manuscript pages, I haven't been able to find out who exactly had the fortune to be compared to the rhubarb plant. In fact, the 1646 edition, so this is the 29, there we go. So this is a different edition of the same book, has a different poem attached to it. I haven't quite worked out why there are two different poems, but the description of the thing that the rhubarb is praised for in both is exactly the same, that it can be used for young and old, and that its medicinal qualities cannot be improved upon. Matthäus Merian was from the famous Swiss Merian family and worked for the family of engravers descended from Theodore de Brey. De Brey, the Flemish designer, engraver, printmaker, and publisher, born in Liège, fled to Strasbourg to escape religious persecution at the hands of the Spanish Catholics and moved to England in 1586, where he was exposed to stories and artistic depictions of European exploration of the New World. He returned to Germany in 1589, where he began to publish numerous volumes of literature about New World exploration. China, too, featured in these illustrated publications, and the works of de Brey and Merian were hugely significant in shaping the European vision of the unknown world. Interesting to note, then, that rhubarb is not represented as anything other than a local crop presented in a productive but local landscape. The China Illustrata, compiled by Athanasius Kircher in the second half of the 17th century and published in Amsterdam in 1667, brought together the knowledge and visual information from Boehm and the most recent details about its cultivation from Nieuwhof. Rhubarb grows in great abundance, not only in the province of Sichuan, but also in the mountains of Shanxi. The flowers resemble tufts in the shape of a bell, jagged at the ends. The leaves are long, rough to the touch. The root is whitish within while fresh, but when dried, it assumes the color it has when it comes to us. It presents everything together, the specific location where the plant grows, the bioscientific descriptions of the plant, but also the physical relationship to the customer at home. And in the background here, so you see the regular planting of the crop in regular distances, and if you look closely, you see the hanging of the rhubarb root on the side, and the root here in itself is enlarged at the front. The distance between the plant's site of origin in China and the user-consumer in Europe, unknowable to Dioscorides and unfathomable in Ruysbroek and Polo, has become knowable and in fact relatively short. Like with so many other goods from Asia, in the 18th century they'd become part of a daily experience in Europe. A few thoughts in conclusion. The insight that things traveled throughout the early modern world is not at all new, neither is the insight that meanings assigned to things and the knowledge systems in which those acquire meaning change as they travel. Pamela Smith, to name but one example, has shown how the repertoires of knowledge associated with certain commodities travel through time and space. What has struck me as I started to explore this world of rhubarb is that the thing itself and the knowledge of that thing travel in very different ways. What rhubarb is understood to be, is what changes, as does the relationship to its source. The place where it comes from moves in and out of focus, depending on the circumstances. But as China becomes more knowable over the course of the 17th century, with first-hand observers of modes of cultivation and medical application, rhubarb loses some of its near magical potency available only to the few, to deal with that most incomprehensible of human illnesses, to become a herbal remedy available for all, for young and old, to deal with the most common of all human diseases, afflictions of the digestive tract. Thank you very much.
The floor is now open for questions. Just also a reminder that we are anticipating the rhubarb season just a little bit here with tonight's talk. Please.
Thank you very much. That was really very, very interesting. I wonder, I'm not completely sure about this, but I think that rhubarb is also in the Tucunum sanitatis, which is a completely Western source. And I wonder whether there's a whole Western tradition that is not part of your discussion here. In other words, something that's more indigenous to Europe, or that if it's known, I mean, it's an 11th century document originally from Baghdad. I'm sure you're familiar with it. That it ends up in Europe, and it's heavily illustrated in the very end of the 14th, very early 15th century, and it's kind of a luxury manuscript. And what that's something that also, in the same way that you showed all these fascinating Chinese herbal or sort of medical sources, lists the properties of all of these different fruits and vegetables and tells you how they affect your body, the humoral system, essentially, which I know is different in China, but I think they're parallels. So I just wonder, is there part of the story that's about the knowledge of it in Europe before the contact with China? That's the question.
What does the materia medica?
Sorry?
There's the materia medica, which you mentioned, I guess.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a very interesting question, and I think what it points to immediately is that I'm at an early stage, and I didn't. There are lots of dimensions about rhubarb. This is a huge topic. Little did I know when I thought I could use rhubarb nicely as a way of illustrating other issues, that this was a huge area. So there's a huge amount that I don't know. I mean, the whole of the Russian dimension, which comes mostly into focus for the 18th century, I've left out. The whole Islamic
Right.
mediating role in all this I have not touched upon at all. I suppose the honest answer would be to say that I came at this as originally a historian of China, now someone who works more on the exchange between Asia and Europe. And what I'm interested in is the connection between something that came from China, about which only gradually this knowledge about the original source, because this particular plant only comes from quite a small part of the world. Now, what I've tried to tease out is how those two move in and out of focus and how China is mediated through that.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, I'm going to write everything there is to
Right.
know about rhubarb. So, absolutely, it's clearly known about in the classical tradition in Europe and has a whole ongoing conversation about what it is and where it came from within the European context. That wasn't necessarily what I was trying to get at.
Understood. Yeah, so my question was just how that might enlighten your story in some way in terms of all the European interpretations of it and whether that figures into it at all. So again, I'm sure there's no answer
Yeah, well,
right now, but-
what I was trying to tease out, and there is much more to read before I could conclusively make any claims about this. What I was trying to tease out is how China comes into vision and how that vision is sharpened over time. So I haven't looked at a whole tradition that doesn't touch on that at all.
Yeah, understood. So this is sort of a case study, and my second part of the question, and then I'll stop, is what, are there other products, other plants that you could tell the same story with, or is rhubarb really unique? And maybe you don't even, maybe you've just chosen this.
Well, I think ginger is another, there are lots of commodities that you could put in a similar category. So certainly ginger, also something called China root, certainly ginseng, which Carla Nappi has written about. Various other commodities that have a similar kind of, somewhere in between medicine and food, somewhere between the different constellations of knowledge that come together somehow in this world, but not necessarily in a very logical way, and certainly not in a packaged form. I think that's really what I'm trying to tease out, how commodity and knowledge don't necessarily travel together.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm going to ask you a question a little bit as a devil's advocate. And if I argue that rhubarb doesn't exist, and this is just textual history of people writing about textual history as if they were writing about unicorns. What in this argument actually has to do with rhubarb rather than the theoretical objects / textual objects known as the rhubarb, to which most people probably didn't have any access, and they just wrote about it and quoted one another ever since the Materia Medica onward. This is not about an object moving. This is about textual sources being quoted by other people writing texts. So that's my question as a devil's advocate. I would argue the rhubarb did not exist until 1901, and all the
What happened in 1901?
Nothing, just make up for it. 1967. I heard 1967 was a big year. There was a big MoMA show about 1967. Let's say the rhubarb arrived in 1967. Until then, it was only in text, starting from the Materia Medica. And as you showed us today, people were really referring to one another when they produced texts about rhubarb without having any contact with this thing. So,
I don't think it's a
did
problem
you
at
actually
all.
produce a story about global objects or materials or plants moving, or just the textual history of people writing about
Yes.
something that does not exist, like a unicorn?
Well, no,
If you write the global history of unicorn, you may get to the same map here, by the way.
No, I totally agree. As it happens, my father has written a book about the global history
Here
of
we
the
go.
unicorn.
Here we go. To what extent
So
actually-
I think actually that is not at all a problem, and I think in fact it doesn't matter one bit whether this commodity actually travelled. I think it's highly unlikely that all of the rhubarb that's being described was written about by people who actually truly understood it, had used it, had seen it in action, and so forth. What I do know is that if we say at some point this rhubarb root did come into existence, 1901, 1967, whenever, when that does happen, whenever it does, it seems to have a very strong purgative quality. So it is something that seems to empty the gut, and with this beautiful added action of closing the gut up after it cleans, after it's done, right? So at some point, there is a commodity that starts to do that. Surprisingly,
at some point there's a need for a commodity for doing that, and that's a different question.
So I have no problem with arguing that this whole thing is just about a fiction, right? I think actually that could very well be. What's quite interesting is to see how that fiction then gets translated into lots of different cultural contexts, and how people quote each other, and how only gradually, I mean, you can see that in the way the plant appears, right? It's quite a lot of variety of how this plant looks. So it's entirely possible. The only thing that I think poses a bit of a question mark there is the fact that when it then does come into material being, it seems to have exactly that function that they seem to write about it as early as the 11th century or the 13th century. So they're writing about some substance that, if they ever came into contact with it, seems to clear out the gut.
Or again, they're writing about a problem to which they find something that could be the substance that will solve the problem.
Yeah?
But it's not about the substance, it's about the problem. You see what I mean? Are you writing the history of the material, or are you writing the history of the problem? And
well,
I'm just playing a devil's advocate. I'm sorry, I'm trying to.
No, I don't have it. I think it's a very interesting question. So I think I'm writing about text, exactly as you say. I think I am writing about what people think this is, and they copy each other and they change it slightly, and that's quite, to me, quite interesting. Maybe maybe there are some people who say, if it's only about text, I'm not interested. That's fine by me. But I think there is something substantial to it, and I think the problem is not the same problem all the time, right? So there is a variety. If it is only about a problem, then it's not the same problem all the time. So it's getting at something, whatever that is.
Thank you.
That
was great. It's great. I mean, thank you for indulging me.
Well, yeah.
Thank you very much.
But interestingly then, from the Western perspective, you're basically writing about the history of the herbal in Western publishing, because this is the essence of what herbals are at that time, regardless of whatever plant or even animal, which I also described in herbals you look at. And there's this very strong tradition, especially in early printing, where it's sort of an Aristotelian principle of repetition and copying versus one that's based on natural study and innovation that sort of rub against each other for the whole of the late 15th and 16th century, and that's sort of the essence of what those books are at that time. So if you want to tease out what you're looking for, it means basically looking at every edition of every copy to really isolate those moments in time when something new infiltrates the books and must have come from an outside source.
Yeah,
it's a very tense study.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And so this broadly sketched sort of preliminary stage, I think it touches on some of these changes that then would need to be teased out very, very carefully into these different editions. And I think it becomes even more than just this kind of textual tradition, which is transformed, I'm pretty sure, by the first-hand observations, which add only another tradition of text and another style of writing to it, but do change what is constructed as knowledge and understanding of rhubarb in Europe at the time. So I think it isn't just a question of producing a new edition. I think there are some very significant things that I've teased out a little bit here, and I think could be teased out much more precisely. And so, for example, the presence of the references to pests and their disappearance, I think, could be teased out much more precisely when this becomes a much bigger project, if it does. Yeah, whether it's worth it, I don't know yet.
Thank you. In the 14th century in China, is disease plague understood in terms of miasma? Is contagion a carrier of disease? There's a specific reason why I'm asking. I was really struck by your the quote that you showed about rhubarb curing the 10,000 men in the army, because it was obviously ingested. And what I find really curious is in 16th and 17th century plague tracts in Europe, rhubarb is present, but it's as something that's eaten rather than something, the pungent cinnamon and clove and rose that's used to counteract miasma, because plague is understood to be drawn into the body through the sense of smell. So I'm really, now I'm like racking my brains for like all of the reference I've ever come across rhubarb in like my study of plague. And by the way, I'd like love to talk to you later about Yersinia pestis, because I really don't think that we can describe that term to what was happening in the medieval and early modern period. But that's the same cone debate to indulge in maybe over drinks at dinner. But I'm wondering if like sense history has a role to play in this East-West exploration, because I'm wondering if in Chinese medicine how disease is understood as to be transmitted and to impact the body, ways in which it's similar or different than the Western counterpart. And maybe that's why, if there is a difference, maybe that's why rhubarb didn't play such a predominant role in the pharmacopoeia that was used to counteract plague in Europe in the medieval and early modern period, because it doesn't have a pungent smell. So I guess that my question is one about properties and understanding of how these different cultures read them and how they fit into their classification systems.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I don't know enough about the construction of different kinds of diseases, because as I was saying earlier, this has led me into a history of medicine that I'm completely out of my depth. I don't know why I keep doing that. I don't know why I do that. I just stick with the few things that I do know. So I think so that's very interesting. So the senses and the sense of smell. So I don't think miasma is relevant, and I don't think that's the way in which that's not the way that is constructed.
Because it seems to have been something on hand, ready to be deployed in China in this time and place for the stricken army, whereas Europe is just like, oh my God, what the hell's going on? And they don't use rhubarb.
Well, so what Bob Himes is talking about is that these two things are a new thing. So the Mongols are moving into this specific area in Gansu, for which there are a couple of sources, historical documents, which it's that movement into a new environment, right? As I understand it, that's the way in which the transformations in bacterial population create this particular polytomy that causes the spread of the plague. That it's in that area that they observe that this is a new thing for the Mongols moving into that area, which creates this epidemic, which they had. I mean, epidemics obviously were happening, but this particular kind was a new one for the Mongols, for which they did not have a ready-made cure, although Himes is fairly vague on this, whether it's local knowledge that makes them use rhubarb, which is grown locally, which seems to me slightly more unlikely. But so the exact combination of using rhubarb, this reference to rhubarb, which he calls a strange reference in this text, I think hasn't been teased out at all in other sources yet. And I think so. I don't know that I'm going to be the one doing this. I think I'm going to leave that to Bob Himes. And then when he's done that work, I'm going to think about that some more, because he's not interested necessarily in how that then spreads. But I think you're absolutely right. There are very different ways of thinking about disease at work, and there may be some role for the senses in that. Although I'm not aware of Chinese medicine using smell and as a way of warding off disease.
Yeah, thanks.
That's not really an answer to that at all, but
no, but it's provocative for more discussion. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there other, following along the lines of Don's question, could we imagine other kinds of contexts, knowledge of which could help us understand the ways in which the rhubarb was instructive. So if disease theory is one context that helps us see the rhubarb in a particular light, are there other possible ones, commercial ones, political ones, aesthetic ones, where the rhubarb could appear differently?
Excuse me. So I think in the 18th century, we can start to do that. So I think in the 18th century, it becomes a traded commodity in much larger quantities. The trade becomes, there's competition over the trade. It starts, lots of other groups of the population start to get involved. So certain traders from Central Asia, Russian traders get involved, and because the quantities that are coming in are much larger, they start to impose different kinds of quality controls on the product. And Russian rhubarb, which is still Chinese rhubarb but traded through Russia, becomes constructed as the best rhubarb, only because the Russian trade system tries to limit the quantities that are coming through and imposing a tax over it and passing that on as the only best quality rhubarb that is available for trade. So they create a kind of trade barrier in the process. So I think then the commercial world starts to interfere in this process, which starts to generate different kinds of ideas about it, and would provide the kind of, you know, direction that you say, establishing it in a different way. I think the aesthetics of it, it's very interesting. So I started out by looking at this from, looking at some of the kind of different illustrations, of which this, you know, this is a 19th century example, but looking through just the illustration, the botanical illustrations of rhubarb leads you into very different directions, and it leads you mostly into the 19th century. But I think that too gets you at different ways of understanding what rhubarb is and how it's classified, how it fits into a Linnaean system and into other kind of taxonomies of knowledge. Which, yeah, I think are part of the story. They're part also of the appropriation into different, you know, very European knowledge system that kind of are a slightly more hermetically sealed world. It's obviously very tied up with empire and power and with the kind of Foucauldian knowledge systems. And I think it takes me a little bit too far, again, from the story that I was interested in here. But I think if you take a broader chronology, different realms open up to bring into this story.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. So my question is about the circulation of natural knowledge or bodies of knowledge and the practices of translation. Because what struck me in your talk is that we don't really see instances of translation, right? As them reading Materia Vetica or whatever texts that are being filtered into Europe, perhaps not, or being brought back, or texts being translated by the Jesuits. And I'm thinking of Harold Cook's work on natural knowledge or Materia Vetica and translation. But instead, it seems that what is being treated as authoritative knowledge is actually coming from observation, right? So being able to claim that one had seen the cultivation of rhubarb or had seen the purchase and circulation of it, rather than, I think, what we typically think of when we think of early modern exchange and pathways of transmission is through this practice of translation as opposed to observation. Does that make sense? Is that distinction? So I'm just curious.
So your question is that right, or are there also?
Am I misreading the narrative?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. Yeah, I think I have come across in this story of rhubarb less of an emphasis on the translation of terms, for example, an emphasis on the translation of particular information that came through in written form. The Jesuits obviously translate vast amounts of material, but I am not, I think in these sections where they're talking about the flora and fauna, they are relying much more on again, a transmission of text, but not texts that are translated at heart. So they are based on their observations, their, again, it's kind of, as we were saying earlier, kind of a set of fictional assumptions, and some coloured by observations, but a lot of it also basically hearsay from a variety of sources. So, yeah, I don't think translation is such a huge part of this story. So that isn't just how I've constructed it. That is, I think, what's going on there. But again, that may mean that there is another aspect of that. So what I, for example, also haven't looked at is the translation of that knowledge in the other direction, of European knowledge translated into Chinese and circulating. Yeah, so that may be another way of thinking about this.
But I wonder if translation does in fact play less of a role in the circulation of this kind of knowledge about, especially commodities that are being, or goods that are being transported in large quantities, right? In which it's actually the kind of tactile material engagement with the, and the interactions of a marketplace, let's say, that figure more prominently than the transmission of texts as we think of as, authoritative,
sources.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, we obviously do know that about the kind of texts about porcelain making, and that, there is much more an emphasis on that. So I think there is a difference, because this is not a manufactured commodity, and because this is something that's traded and then inserted into a different knowledge system. I think translation is less important, but I could be completely wrong about that. Like, it wouldn't be, So thank you for that. I'll think about that some more.
Other questions? Well, if that's the case, we can conclude here the formal part of our conversation. You're all welcome to linger and belabor the speaker with more questions, either in this room or outside, where there's still some refreshments. And what we have to do now is to thank our speaker for a wonderful